Los Angeles International Airport was its usual whirlwind of movement, luggage wheels rolling against polished floors, hurried conversations blending into a constant hum, and the occasional overhead announcement slicing through the controlled chaos. In the exclusive first-class lounge, where soft lighting and plush seating offered a reprieve from the outside frenzy, Sandra Bullock sat quietly in a corner, immersed in a well-worn paperback book, dressed in simple black leggings, an oversized sweater, and well-loved running shoes. She exuded the effortless ease of someone who prioritized comfort over spectacle. A baseball cap, pulled low over her forehead, shielded her from prying eyes. Despite her global fame, Sandra had never been one to seek unnecessary attention. She valued moments like these, unbothered, unnoticed, just another traveler waiting for her flight. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow, we have another special tale waiting just for you. Across the lounge, Margaret Winchester held court in a different fashion. Her presence, unlike Sandra's, was impossible to ignore. Draped in an impeccably tailored Chanel suit, her diamond-studded earrings sparkled under the ambient lighting, catching the attention of those who knew how to recognize wealth. A pristine Hermes handbag sat on the seat beside her, a silent proclamation that some things, like personal space, could be bought. Margaret's eyes landed on Sandra, and almost instantly, her lips curled into a smirk, the kind born from years of entitlement. She leaned toward her equally polished companion, ensuring her voice carried just far enough to be overheard. "Would you look at that?" she mused, the disdain barely veiled. First-class lounges used to have standards. Now, they let just anyone in. Her words, though spoken at a calculated volume, sliced through the otherwise polite quiet of the lounge. A subtle shift followed. People stole glances from behind their newspapers and phone screens. Some exchanged quiet murmurs, while others cringed at Margaret's open condescension. Sandra, ever composed, barely reacted. Years in the limelight had given her a thick skin, and experience had taught her that some words were better left unchallenged. Without so much as a pause, she turned another page in her book, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable. If Margaret had been looking for a reaction, she would find none. But someone else had taken notice. A man had just stepped into the lounge, his movements quiet yet deliberate, dressed in a simple black jacket, jeans, and well-worn boots. He carried himself with an understated confidence, no fanfare, no entourage, just presence. His sharp yet kind eyes swept the room, assessing, observing, taking in the scene with the quiet patience of someone who had seen it all before. Keanu Reeves. He moved toward the lounge counter, seemingly intent on ordering a coffee, but his focus never wavered. He had heard Margaret's words, had seen the slight yet unmistakable shift in Sandra's posture, and had read the unspoken discomfort lingering in the air. Margaret, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere, continued her performance, adjusting the cuff of her suit as she sighed dramatically. "Honestly," she said to her companion, shaking her head, "you'd think people like that would at least try to look respectable. I mean, if you can afford a first-class ticket, you can certainly afford a stylist." Her companion chuckled lightly, though there was a flicker of unease in her expression. Margaret's voice was carrying farther than intended now, and the growing silence around them was becoming impossible to ignore. As first-class boarding was announced, Sandra rose from her seat with an easy grace. Slipping her book into her bag, she moved through the lounge with quiet confidence, unbothered by the stares, the hushed whispers, or the occasional appraising glances from people who thought they knew what first class should look like. Margaret Winchester, however, was not one for quiet opinions. As luck, or misfortune, would have it, she ended up directly behind Sandra in the boarding line. Her meticulously manicured fingers adjusted the handle of her Louis Vuitton carry-on, the wheels rolling in perfect sync with the click of her heels. She was the picture of wealth, of calculated elegance, of someone who believed exclusivity was her birthright. As her eyes flickered to Sandra's boarding pass, she let out a theatrical sigh, her lips curling in faux amusement. "First class," she mused, her voice carrying just enough for those around them to hear. "Well, isn't that interesting?" Sandra turned slightly, her expression unreadable but undeniably poised. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, not surprise, not irritation, just the patient indifference of someone who had been through this routine before. She met Margaret's gaze for a fraction of a second, then offered a polite, effortless smile, the kind that disarmed, that neutralized unnecessary conflict without giving it power. But Margaret wasn't looking for neutrality. She was looking for dominance. "You know," Margaret continued, her voice loud enough to capture the attention of those waiting nearby. "There was a time when people actually dressed appropriately for first class, when it was an experience reserved for the elite, a privilege, not a convenience." She smoothed her designer scarf for emphasis, allowing the expensive silk to catch the light. The implication was clear. Sandra's casual attire, her leggings, her oversized sweater, the well-worn baseball cap that concealed most of her face, was, in Margaret's world, an offense, an intrusion into a space she deemed sacred. Sandra, however, remained still. Her fingers lightly adjusted the strap of her bag, but she said nothing. No retort, no eye roll, no attempt to defend her right to be there. Just silence. And that silence? It infuriated Margaret. She glanced at her companion, raising a perfectly arched brow. Some people don't seem to understand that certain spaces should remain exclusive. A few passengers exchanged looks. A woman standing a few spots away bit her lip, uncomfortable with the passive-aggressive tension thickening in the air. A young couple looked between Sandra and Margaret, clearly intrigued but hesitant to intervene. Others simply avoided eye contact, pretending they weren't hearing what was happening. Sandra exhaled softly, tilting her head slightly, as if contemplating whether the moment deserved a response. It didn't. Margaret's words had already revealed more about her than any rebuttal could. A shift in the room pulled Sandra's attention, just outside the lounge entrance, where the controlled elegance of the airport blended into the more chaotic hum of travelers rushing to their gates. A familiar figure had been standing moments earlier, the man in the black jacket. His sharp eyes had taken in the scene before slipping away, unnoticed by most. But he wasn't gone. Not for long. Margaret, too engrossed in her own display of superiority, remained oblivious to the quiet forces shifting around her. She straightened her posture, believing she had successfully established her place in the invisible hierarchy she had crafted in her mind. Sandra, however, knew better. This moment wasn't about clothing or wealth or exclusivity. It was about character. And the character had a way of revealing itself in the most unexpected ways. As the passengers settled into their seats, the hum of quiet conversation and the rustling of carry-ons filled the first-class cabin. Margaret, perched elegantly in her aisle seat, adjusted her designer scarf and took a slow sip of champagne, her fingers gliding along the crystal rim with an air of detached superiority. The moment Sandra placed her modest backpack in the overhead compartment, Margaret let out another exaggerated sigh, loud enough to turn heads. She waited a beat, then leaned forward slightly, ensuring her voice carried. "Darling," she called out to Sandra in a sing-song tone laced with condescension, "I think you may have wandered into the wrong section. The economy is a few rows back." A few passengers winced at the comment. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others sank into their seats, unwilling to become part of the unfolding tension. A businessman in the next row flicked his eyes toward the confrontation, then back to his laptop screen, clearly opting for neutrality. A younger woman, earbuds in, paused her music, pretending to scroll through her phone but fully tuned into the interaction. Sandra, exuding the kind of patience only true confidence brings, simply settled into her seat without so much as a glance in Margaret's direction. Instead of engaging, she pulled her book from her bag, flipping it open with deliberate ease. There was no need to acknowledge the insult. Silence, after all, was the best rebuttal to pettiness. The flight attendant approached with a warm smile, her hands neatly folded as she prepared to offer pre-flight drinks. But before she could speak, a new voice interrupted, a voice that commanded attention without effort. "Hey, Sandy, I thought I recognized you at the gate." The cabin shifted. Heads turned. Conversations ceased. And Margaret's smirk froze in place. Keanu Reeves stood there, effortlessly composed. His signature black jacket draped over his arm. His presence was a quiet force, exuding the kind of charisma that needed no theatrics. He wasn't just another passenger. He was Keanu Reeves. Sandra's face lit up with genuine warmth. She set her book down and turned toward him, her smile easy and sincere. "Keanu, I had no idea you were on this flight." Margaret's hand, still poised around her champagne glass, trembled slightly. The realization dawned in slow, agonizing waves. She had spent the last half hour belittling one of Hollywood's most respected actresses, casually, dismissively, as if she were a nobody. And now, another icon had just entered the equation. Keanu's gaze flickered toward Margaret, not in a way that was aggressive, not even condemning, just assessing, taking in the moment, the energy, the weight of what had just transpired. His expression remained composed, but there was something unmistakable in his stance, a quiet authority. "You know," he said, his voice smooth, calm, but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of meaning. "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about standards." Margaret, who had just moments ago been basking in the illusion of superiority, suddenly felt her world tilt. Her confidence wavered, and though she tried to maintain her poise, her fingers curled a fraction tighter around her glass. Keanu's tone remained level, no anger, no need for dramatics, just simple truth. "In my experience," he continued, locking eyes with her for the briefest of moments, "true class isn't about what you wear. It's about how you treat people." The words hung in the air, weighty yet effortless, striking deeper than any insult ever could. Margaret's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came, because what could she say? What possible retort could hold any power against that kind of truth? Sandra, watching the moment unfold, remained quiet, not because she needed Keanu to speak for her, but because sometimes the best response was letting the moment speak for itself. The first-class cabin had gone completely silent. Every passenger was now focused on the unfolding scene, their attention no longer subtle. The businessman who had chosen neutrality now leaned back in his seat. Intrigued, the young woman with earbuds slowly removed one, her gaze locked onto the situation in front of her. Margaret swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She straightened in her seat, forcing a smile that did nothing to mask her discomfort. Of course," she said lightly, waving a hand as if brushing the moment away. "I was just making conversation." Keanu's expression didn't change. He offered a slight, knowing smile, then shifted his attention back to Sandra. "Mind if I sit for a bit?" Sandra chuckled softly, motioning to the empty seat beside her. "Be my guest." As Keanu settled in, Margaret turned sharply toward her champagne, her shoulders stiff. The atmosphere had shifted entirely, and she could feel it. The murmurs around the cabin weren't about admiration for her wealth or style. They were about her mistake. A mistake the internet would likely hear about soon enough. The flight attendant, sensing the shift, quickly recovered and offered Keanu a drink. As he accepted, he glanced once more toward Margaret, then back at Sandra, before leaning back into his seat, utterly at ease. And as the plane taxied down the runway, Margaret sat in silence, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that money could buy luxury, but it couldn't buy respect. And in that moment, in the presence of true grace, she had never felt smaller. Margaret's confidence had evaporated, replaced by a slow, sinking realization that spread through her like ice water in her veins. She had spent the last hour making cutting remarks, speaking with the assumption that she was the most important presence in the room, completely unaware of the company she was in. The weight of her own arrogance settled heavily on her shoulders. Her diamond earrings, her designer scarf, her tailored suit, none of it felt as significant as it had when she first stepped onto the plane. The symbols of her success, once a source of power, now felt meaningless in the face of the two people sitting across from her, people whose success was built not on money or elitism, but on something far greater: respect. The flight attendant, now smiling knowingly, broke the thick silence. "Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves, can I offer you anything to drink?" Her tone was polite, professional, but there was a distinct warmth to it, a quiet acknowledgement of who they were, not just as celebrities, but as people who carried themselves with quiet dignity. Margaret flinched at the sound of their names being spoken so formally, her stomach twisting in discomfort. The whispers among passengers turned into murmurs. Some looked amused, their lips twitching with barely suppressed smiles. Others looked at Margaret with thinly veiled disappointment. She could feel their eyes, their silent judgment wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. The superiority she had so proudly worn moments before now felt embarrassingly misplaced. Keanu, ever composed, took his seat next to Sandra. He turned to Margaret one last time, his expression calm but unwavering, his voice carrying the weight of a lesson that had been long overdue. "I think the real lesson here," he said gently, yet with undeniable firmness, "is that success and kindness aren't mutually exclusive. You don't have to choose between being important and being decent." The words were like a mirror reflecting back her worst traits, forcing Margaret to confront a truth she had long ignored. She had always believed that power came from status, from wealth, from exclusivity. But here sat two of the most successful people in the world, and neither had needed arrogance or cruelty to prove their worth. Their presence, their character, their treatment of others, that was what made them stand apart. Sandra, who had remained gracious through it all, smiled softly. Her voice was gentle, but there was no mistaking the meaning behind her words. "And the funny thing about first class," she mused, tilting her head slightly, "it's not about money. It's about the experience. Maybe today was a learning one for all of us." Margaret's mouth opened as if to say something, to defend herself, to salvage the tattered remains of her dignity. But no words came. What could she say? That she hadn't meant it? That she hadn't realized who she was speaking to? Neither excuse would erase the reality of her actions. The designer scarf she had once worn as a mark of luxury now felt tight around her neck, constricting, suffocating. She shifted in her seat, the once comfortable leather now feeling like it was swallowing her whole. The hush in the cabin was deafening, and then a voice broke the silence. A passenger a few rows back, an older gentleman with silver hair and a knowing smirk, let out a quiet chuckle. "All that talk about class," he murmured just loud enough for those around him to hear. And she didn't even recognize the real thing when it was sitting right in front of her. A ripple of quiet laughter followed, discreet but sharp enough to twist the knife deeper into Margaret's realization. She sank lower in her seat, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass as if holding onto the last vestiges of her composure. She could feel the lesson settling in, unshakable and unavoidable. For the first time in a long time, Margaret Winchester was silent. And maybe, just maybe, she had finally started to listen. As the flight continued, Margaret remained uncharacteristically quiet. The confidence she had wielded so carelessly before was now nowhere to be found. She barely touched her champagne, her fingers tracing absent patterns along the rim of the glass. The silence around her wasn't one of power but of reflection, heavy with the weight of a realization she couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Sandra and Keanu conversed effortlessly, their friendship so natural that it only highlighted how misplaced Margaret's obsession with appearances had been. They laughed over past experiences, shared stories of unexpected adventures, and spoke with an authenticity that required no validation from wealth or status. Their connection was genuine, built on mutual respect rather than the fragile illusion of importance. Margaret found herself listening, not out of obligation, but because she couldn't help it. The contrast between them and her own behavior gnawed at her, making her hyper-aware of every shallow comment she had made. How foolish she must have looked, desperately clinging to a sense of superiority that, in the end, had meant nothing. As the plane began its descent, Margaret felt her heart pounding. The idea of leaving this moment unresolved was unbearable. She had spent her life dictating the rules of social hierarchy, believing herself to be above moments like these. But now, in the presence of two people whose reputations dwarfed hers in every meaningful way, She understood how small she had made herself, summoning what little courage she had left. She stood up. The cabin was still, the hush before landing settling over the passengers. Margaret's voice, now stripped of arrogance, was barely above a whisper. "Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves," she hesitated, her hands tightening at her sides. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't performing. I need to apologize." Sandra turned toward her, surprise flickering across her face. But she didn't recoil. She didn't dismiss her. Instead, she met Margaret's gaze with the same kindness that had been there all along. "We all have moments we're not proud of," Sandra said gently, her voice steady but warm. "What matters is what we take from them." Keanu nodded, his eyes unreadable but not unkind. "Sometimes the best lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments." Margaret swallowed hard, her throat tight, the usual reflex to explain, to defend, to justify, fought to surface. But she pushed it down. There were no excuses to be made, just acceptance. She nodded, her carefully curated exterior finally cracking to reveal something real. "Thank you," she whispered. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the energy in the cabin felt different. There was no dramatic fanfare, no grand gestures, just an understanding that something had shifted. Margaret sank back into her seat, but for the first time, she didn't feel the need to hide behind her expensive persona. She let herself breathe. As passengers began disembarking, many left with a new perspective, one that proved real class isn't about luxury, but about the way we treat others when we think no one is watching. And perhaps, for Margaret, this flight had been the beginning of something far more valuable than status. She stood in the aisle, watching as Sandra and Keanu exited the plane together, their laughter soft but unforced. And as she followed behind, Margaret allowed herself a small, unguarded smile. The terminal buzzed with movement, a symphony of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and murmured conversations. Travelers moved with purpose, some rushing toward their next connection, others reuniting with family and friends. Amidst the commotion, Margaret stood still, an unfamiliar sense of uncertainty settling over her. It wasn't the first time she had traveled first class. It wasn't even the first time she had stood at an arrival gate, waiting to be whisked away by an awaiting driver. But something was different. For the first time in a long time, she felt small, not in the way she had always feared, but in a way that made her aware of how vast the world truly was. Her gaze traveled across the terminal, and there, near the baggage claim, stood Sandra and Keanu. Unlike her, they weren't rushing. They weren't expecting a limousine, a grand exit, or any special attention. They simply existed, two people, effortlessly blending into the crowd despite their global recognition. Sandra caught sight of Margaret first, her expression softening as their eyes met. She gave a small, knowing smile. "Heading home?" she asked, adjusting the strap of her carry-on bag. Margaret hesitated, glancing down at her phone. A message from her assistant flashed across the screen. "Your driver is outside." She knew she could leave, knew she could slip back into the life she had always known, where every moment was planned, every interaction curated. But suddenly, the thought of returning to that predictability felt hollow. I don't know. Maybe," she admitted, her voice quieter than she had intended. Keanu, ever perceptive, studied her with the same quiet wisdom he had exuded throughout the flight. "Sometimes, after a long journey, you don't go back the same way you came," he said, his words deliberate, but without pressure. Margaret exhaled slowly, nodding. The truth of his statement settled deep within her. For so long, she had measured success by wealth, by exclusivity, by the number of people she could impress. But now, standing here, she realized she had been looking at it all wrong. The urge to retreat clawed at her, whispering that it was easier to return to what she knew. But another voice inside, softer, yet stronger, urged her to stay, to step into the unknown, to see what lay beyond the life she had built so carefully around appearances. Clearing her throat, she took a small step forward. "Would you too like to grab a coffee?" Sandra exchanged a glance with Keanu, and then, with an easy smile, she nodded. "We'd love to." Margaret hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words. As they walked through the terminal, past bustling shops and crowded cafes, Margaret felt something unfamiliar but wonderful, a sense of possibility. She listened as Sandra and Keanu spoke, not about business or Hollywood, but about the simple joys in life. Favorite bookstores, quiet mornings, the unexpected beauty of an ordinary day. These were conversations she had never taken the time to have before. She had been too busy ensuring she was seen, too occupied with being important to appreciate the moments that made life meaningful. They found a small coffee shop tucked into the corner of the terminal, away from the rush of travelers. The air was rich with the scent of espresso, the quiet hum of conversation creating an intimate atmosphere. Keanu ordered tea, Sandra a cappuccino, and Margaret, after a moment's hesitation, chose a simple black coffee. She had never ordered it that way before. Normally, she chose something elaborate, something that sounded refined. But today, she wanted something real. As she took a sip, she was surprised by how comforting the warmth felt. "You know," Margaret said, staring at the steam rising from her cup, "I've spent so much of my life curating an image, making sure people saw me a certain way. I don't even know who I am without it." Sandra set her cappuccino down gently, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's the journey you're supposed to be on now." Margaret looked up, something flickering in her eyes, hesitation, but also curiosity. A journey, not of money, not of status, but of rediscovery. For the first time, it didn't sound terrifying. Keanu leaned back in his chair, watching her with the same quiet understanding he had shown all day. "Every day is a chance to be better," he said simply. "That's the beauty of it." Margaret let out a small laugh, one that, for the first time in a long time, wasn't forced. It wasn't bitter, nor was it rehearsed. It was real. As they sat together, sharing stories over cups of coffee, Margaret realized something profound. This wasn't just a post-flight conversation. It was something bigger, an invitation to step into a different kind of life. One where she didn't have to prove anything to anyone. One where she could just be. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready for it. The coffee shop's gentle hum of conversation and clinking porcelain filled the space between them. For a while, Margaret simply listened, something she wasn't used to doing. Sandra and Keanu spoke effortlessly, never once trying to outshine the other, never seeking validation in the way she so often did. She envied it, their ease, their comfort in their own skin. Finally, she set down her cup. "What if I don't know how to change?" The words came out before she could stop them, and suddenly, all eyes were on her. Sandra's expression softened. "No one does at first," she said, "but that's the point of the journey." Margaret exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I've spent so long chasing the idea of what success is supposed to look like. What if I've been wrong this whole time?" Keanu's gaze was steady. "Then you start over." Margaret scoffed lightly, shaking her head. "That's easy for you to say. You're Keanu Reeves." Keanu chuckled. "And you're Margaret Winchester. Your name doesn't define you. Your actions do." She stared at him for a long moment, then turned to Sandra, who simply nodded in agreement. Margaret felt something shift deep within her, an unsettling but necessary crack in the foundation of everything she had believed about power and status. But before she could say more, a sharp voice cut through the space behind them. "Oh, now this is interesting." Margaret stiffened. She knew that voice. Turning slightly, she saw Veronica Fields, the epitome of high society gossip, the woman who thrived on others' misfortunes. She stood just a few feet away, arms crossed, a smug smile curling her perfectly painted lips. Beside her, a small group of women, all dressed in designer attire, watched like vultures waiting to swoop. Veronica's eyes flickered between Margaret, Sandra, and Keanu, amusement dancing in them. Margaret Winchester, sharing coffee with, well, people. Margaret's throat tightened. This was her past. This was the world she had built her reputation in. And now, it was staring her down, daring her to retreat, to fall back into place. Sandra and Keanu exchanged looks, but neither spoke. This wasn't their battle. It was Margaret's. Margaret took a deep breath and met Veronica's gaze. "Yes, I am," she said, voice calm but firm. "And?" Veronica laughed, clearly expecting her to break, to snap back into her usual role. "Oh, come on, darling. We both know this isn't you. First-class lounges, galas, exclusivity, that's where you belong." Margaret felt a familiar pull, the urge to play the part, to fit the mold. But then she glanced at Sandra and Keanu, at the cups of coffee in front of them, at the warmth she had felt in their presence. For the first time, she saw Veronica for what she truly was, a reflection of who Margaret used to be. And she no longer wanted to be that person. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Maybe I don't belong there anymore." A flicker of surprise crossed Veronica's face, but she recovered quickly, forcing another laugh. "Oh, please, you're Margaret Winchester. People like us don't change." Margaret let the words settle for a moment, then smiled, a small, genuine smile, one that wasn't rehearsed or meant to impress. "I guess we'll see." She turned back to Sandra and Keanu, ignoring Veronica's sharp intake of breath. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to defend her choices. She had already made her decision. As Veronica huffed and stalked off, Margaret finally felt it, that weight she had carried for years. The constant pressure to maintain an illusion of superiority, it lifted. Sandra raised her cappuccino in a quiet toast. "To new beginnings." Margaret clinked her coffee cup against Sandra's, then Keanu's. She took a sip, letting the warmth spread through her, and realized something remarkable. She wasn't scared anymore. As they laughed and continued their conversation, Margaret understood that this moment, this coffee shop, this company, wasn't just a brief escape from her old life. It was the start of something entirely new, and for the first time in her life, she was ready to embrace it.